Episode 137, Religious Trauma with Anna Clark Miller. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, I have a conversation with Anna Clark Miller. Anna is a trauma recovery professional, and this is a very important topic for those of us navigating deconstruction. All of us, in one way or another, have been harmed by our religious experiences. But we can do something about that, and there is help available for those of us that need it. I do intend to have Anna back on again, so if you have any thoughts or questions following this episode, please send them to reasonpress@gmail.com and I'll be sure to include them in a future conversation with Anna. As always, see the show notes for links to Anna's content and other items that we reference. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. This is a bit of a departure from some of the content that I do, but one that is very important and, to be quite frank about it, overdue here for Still Unbelievable. This is a subject we should have touched a while ago, and I'm very pleased that now at last we are touching it. So if you're not familiar with this name, you will become familiar with it, I promise, and it is somebody you need to look up and listen to. So Anna Clark Miller, you do counselling, you specialise in religious trauma. I've listened to your brilliantly, fantastically named podcast, Martyr, She Wrote. I love it. It is now fighting for my top 3 of my favourite podcast names. And until tonight, my favourite podcast name was Life Unwasted by a couple of lads who do a fantastic podcast about the experiences of missionary kids, and yours is fighting theirs for the top spot in terms of podcast names. It's very good when we have a podcast that's a really cool name. Yours meets that criteria. And with that said, please tell my listeners who you are, what you do, why you do what you do, and we'll get into the depths of the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I am, like you mentioned, I'm a therapist. I work with clients, and the main specialty that I work with is religious trauma and spiritual abuse. So I have my own personal history of religious trauma, which is what sort of piqued my interest in the topic several years back. And I have been working with this population for about 10 years or so now. And it's just really my passion to raise awareness among people in, all kinds of different religious settings about the damage that can happen, especially in high control groups.
Thank you. And I think that high control is probably the key phrase in that. Certainly one thing that I've become more and more aware of as more and more people come into the deconstructed community and talk about trauma and hurt is something that bubbles up to the top. To give you a very good example of how key that subject is in this phrase, my listeners already know, they're probably bored of me saying it, but I'm going to say it again. I got involved in a book project at the tail end of last year. The fantastic book, Apostate, tells the story of 21 people leaving religion. And only a couple of weeks ago, I had a conversation with a Christian apologist who contacted me about the book. He's read the book. And one of the things he said to me about the book is not a lot of the authors engage with the evidences for Christianity. And this particular apologist comes from the point of view as he thinks that Christianity has good evidential value. And I try to counter with, when I go into deconstruction communities, and there are multiple groups on Facebook that talk about deconstruction, evidence is not a big subject. People do not talk about they left Christianity because of evidence a lot. It's hurt, it's pain, it's broken relationships. This is the subject that talks about. You get people who have left, they're confident that that Christianity is not true. They're confident the claims of Christianity are not true, yet the hell question still bothers them at night. And it comes up again and again and again from rational adults, from mature adults who've left Christianity, and that still hangs around in their mind. So, and I think as I've become more and more aware of that kind of thing happening, I think that's the more important thing to address in this community. The whole evidence question about Christianity, yes, there are apologists who think that's important. Yes, that forms a significant part of my journey, but I might be the minority in that. And people are hurt. And if a system is hurting people, I don't care if it's true or not. They need to leave the source of that hurt.
Right. Well, and I think, faith and spirituality is not just a cognitive thing. So, sure, the evidence does matter, and that is important, but it's not the whole picture by any stretch of the imagination. Our faith engages the emotional side of who we are. It encompasses all of our being. And so even if you have all these facts and evidence and research, if you're trying to leave out the emotional impact of doctrines and practices, then you're definitely going to miss some really important stuff.
Yes. I think probably, certainly this would have been very important for me when I was leaving it. I'm one of those people who's old enough to have left Christianity long enough ago that he did it on his own. And now we have an opportunity for a lot of people not to go through that, because leaving it on your own is terrifying. And we have communities here which help. So for somebody who's at the early stages of deconstruction, realizing that there's things in the system that are hurting them in one way or another, what's the first thing that you would want to say to that person?
I would want to encourage that person to pay attention to their subjective experiences. Because it's easy, especially if you're in a high control group, to listen to what the group is telling you should be feeling and what the right thing to feel and think is.
Yep.
But I would encourage individuals in that situation to view themselves as an authority on their own experience.
Yeah.
And when you listen to yourself, you can actually make decisions that are about the impact that something is having on you, as opposed to making those decisions based on a narrative from someone else who isn't in your body.
Thank you for that. So before we get too far into the conversation, because I'm sure we'll unpack a bit of that later, can we first of all define what trauma is, what religious trauma is as part of that package of trauma, and then get on to how we could recognize that in ourselves?
Yeah. So trauma essentially is an experience where you feel overwhelming terror and helplessness. And so if you're trying to figure out what qualifies as trauma, ask yourself, was there extreme fear and did you feel helpless to stop it? And so religious trauma is an experience in a faith-based community where the doctrine, the practices, or the group dynamics undermine your sense of safety and autonomy. And so someone who experiences religious trauma, they may or may not necessarily have PTSD, or like lasting trauma impacts, but there's a high chance that you will experience some of those symptoms. And so religious trauma it's a topic that we as a society, have been talking about for decades, but it's not a formal diagnosis. Like if you go into medical manuals, there's not going to be a religious trauma diagnosis that you can get.
Right.
And I actually don't think that's a problem, because we don't have a unique diagnosis for every other kind of trauma either. If I witness a terrorist event, that I will probably get a diagnosis of PTSD. I won't have a specific, uniquely, terrorist trauma kind of thing. And it's same with religious trauma. Anytime a human being experiences overwhelming terror and helplessness, that matters. And we want to pay attention, and we want to be sensitive to the way that impacts that person's nervous system, the way it impacts how they view their own competence and confidence in the world. And when it's in a religious setting, it impacts how they view their spirituality and even the world itself. So religious trauma is something that can have impacts on almost every area of a person's life.
Okay. Would it be fair then to say that religious trauma is just trauma? The religious part describes the cause of the trauma?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So presumably then one of the reasons why the phrase religious trauma is now becoming so prolific is down to the sheer numbers of people who are now in it.
Absolutely. I think for a long time there was a narrative, especially in the psychology and philosophy world. Religion is just sort of a separate entity and it can't possibly cause harm. It's a way to pursue happiness, right?
Yes.
But now I think thankfully, we are acknowledging the nuance there that sure, it can bring positive things into people's lives, but it also can be the source of incredible harm and damage, and it can be used to exploit people in unique ways.
Yes, and I absolutely agree with all of that. Not that I'm the expert, but here on Still Unbelievable, a lot of my brand is very fierce criticism of Christianity. People could even call me anti-religious, and that's possibly a fair way to describe me. But I will acknowledge, yes, there are elements of religiosity that bring benefits to people's lives. Community, well-being, mental well-being, sometimes thinking about other people and their needs and putting them. So there are definitely benefits that can come from constructions or expressions of religion, but not always, which is why we're having the conversation that we're having now. Now, in terms of trauma, most people, when you say I'm suffering from trauma, I'm affected by trauma, the standard mental images of when trauma triggers, somebody becomes completely incapacitated. It's almost like a panic attack. High sweats, they can't focus, they can't see anything through this fog of fear. I'm assuming then the way that religious trauma expresses, though, that is not the only way in which it expresses.
Yeah, so you're right that the stereotypical sort of view of PTSD is someone who's having a flashback and sort of is dissociated from reality because they're just reliving the traumatic experience. And for a religious trauma survivor, that might be the case. They might have flashbacks of their experiences, but there also are often more subtle triggers. For example, if you were in a high control group where you got disciplined by your religious leaders a lot, you might find that when you're at work and your boss calls you in for a meeting, you might be having some heart palpitations and some shortness of breath because you are remembering the feeling of fear of authority. And so things like that can be more emotional kinds of triggers. And then of course there's other elements of fear in certain religious groups. Like, for example, if you were in a group that really emphasized the threat of evil spirits, then you might find yourself feeling really superstitious about needing to say prayers a certain number of times or keeping an eye out for spiritual signs all the time because you are in fear of your spiritual safety. And any number of things can trigger that kind of reaction. But with religious trauma, often in addition to those sort of fear-based triggers, there are a lot of shame-based triggers.
Right.
So a lot of religious groups, especially high control ones, use shame as sort of a motivator for people to buy into the belief system, right? Yes. You need this belief system because you are so unworthy on your own without God. And so a lot of folks with religious trauma find that they are constantly experiencing deep feelings of inadequacy or self-hatred or even, just self-criticism about not being perfect because they were conditioned in their group to constantly blame themselves and constantly look for evidence of their own failure. And that's so debilitating, in everyday life.
Okay. You've said a word there, which I'm going to be honest, I wasn't expecting to hear, and that's the word shame. it makes sense with how you followed that up, but it genuinely wasn't on my radar for something to associate with religious trauma. So we're not even 20 minutes in and I've already learned something. So thank you. So but can we sit on that for a little bit then, because that feels, I'm having memories now, because part of my Christianity, I spent time in a prayer group, and I'm now having memories of praying for people who had feelings of inadequacy, and they wanted prayer to help to lose those feelings. And to be quite honest, it never worked. I never saw that happen. But that's a different conversation. I don't want to talk about other people, whether I name them or not. What was it you said? Something about looking for evidence of their own inadequacy. So that sounds to me like something within the setting that they're in is reinforcing inadequacy to a point where they are incapable, or they don't allow themselves to see their own goodness or see what they're good at as themselves. Does that make sense? And is that true?
Yeah. And I think a lot of religious groups teach that, it's important for us as humans to view ourselves as inadequate. And that is what prompts us to need God, to rely on God, to, ask for provision, because we need to be humble. And if you think about it from a power and control standpoint, that also gives more power to religious groups and religious leaders, because they're saying, hey, you are inadequate, you aren't good enough, you are inherently sinful, or whatever the language is that group uses. And that is why you need to rely on us to guide you, to give you instruction, to hold you accountable, and to discipline you when you need it. And so it creates this system where the members of the group are compelled to confess their weaknesses and to ask for guidance, to ask for forgiveness. And it's almost like being told, hey, we have the remedy, and the problem is your inadequacy. And as long as you keep coming back to us for this remedy of forgiveness, maybe you'll be good enough, maybe. And so that sets up a lot of religious trauma survivors to feel like they just can never be good enough, and that they need something external to earn goodness and to earn acceptance. And so it creates a lot of perfectionism among these survivors, just trying so hard to please authorities and please, society. But even no matter how hard they try, they feel like they're just never quite good enough, and it really undermines a person's sense of confidence and self-efficacy.
I find that really quite saddening that that would happen to an individual. If you'll forgive me going to the gender question, it feels to me like this is something that women suffer from more in churches than men. Is that a fair question?
That's a question I hear a lot, especially in patriarchal sort of religious groups. It's true that men are sort of, given more authority and even really more value than women. But I'm not entirely sure that shame impacts women more than men, because with the sort of privilege and inherent, authority that comes with being a man, also comes a sense of pressure to appear strong and wise and to be a spiritual leader. And often that sort of superhuman pressure reinforces that hidden shame of, I think a lot of men know deep down that they probably haven't earned that superior status.
Right.
And they have to sort of like constantly keep up this facade of, masculinity in order to feel worthy. And so I think men and women struggle with shame in religious settings in their own way, even if it is different.
Okay, I get you. I mean, my question was specifically coming from the very common environment of an evangelical style church, which doesn't even allow women to stand up and
Yes.
talk. But
Yes.
I get what you're saying. It probably manifests in men differently, and maybe it's masked in men better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Women, I think, are told not to even pretend to have authority or wisdom, whereas men are told that like you need to live out that seeming authority.
Yeah. To be quite honest, I am very, very glad that in my marriage, I am not expected to be the boss and make all the decisions. It's much more equal. And frankly, I'm a better man for it. I wouldn't have coped
Mm,
well with the pressure of being the head of the household, having to make every
right.
decision and having to control things. My wife is typically better with the finances and the organizational stuff than I am, for example.
Hmm. Yeah.
So, let the person who's better at that task do that task.
Yeah. I fully agree. And I want to mention though a few other impacts of religious trauma. So we had
Yeah,
talked about fear and we
yeah.
talked about shame.
Hmm.
But another one, there are a few more. So one is rigid thinking, and that is sort of a natural outcome of being raised and conditioned in a group where everything is black and white, right? Everything is right or wrong, everything is good or bad. And it's just very rigid categories of thinking. And a lot of folks who spend a lot of time in a high control group have trouble acknowledging nuance. They have
Right.
trouble recognizing that things aren't always good or bad. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper, and sometimes you don't know the answers to questions.
Hmm.
And so a lot of religious trauma survivors find it very difficult to suspend judgment and be curious when
Hmm.
they're encountering new information. They find it hard to change their minds about things.
Hmm.
And that rigid thinking creates a lot of judgment, both for other people and judgment for ourselves. So that's one of the impacts. Another one is self suppression, which is just the idea that because I'm not good enough and because I have all of these, human emotions and things like that that aren't perfect, I need to push those down and cover them up and hide them and deny them. And so a lot of religious trauma survivors suppress their emotions and even suppress important parts of their identity in hopes of fitting into their group and earning acceptance. And then the last category of impacts that I think is important to acknowledge is the social dysfunction. When you're in a high control group, you learn all kinds of norms that help you fit in and, conform. And when you try and leave and be part of the real world, you find that you have all these dysfunctional habits and dysfunctional expectations from relationships that you then have to unlearn in order to function. And so there's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah, interesting you say that. Would that then explain why some people simply don't socialize outside of their group?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you experienced this, but when I was first leaving my religious group, I felt like it was hard to even talk to people who didn't have a background in that group. It was
Mhm.
like we spoke a different language because I had been trained to use words and phrases that were almost exclusively from the Bible. And I didn't know how to talk without sprinkling that into everything I said. And so, yeah, it's hard to shift from being totally immersed in a community that is all about a faith system to figuring out how to relate to people when that's not the only lens that they're looking at the world through.
Okay, yes. The thing that strikes me the most, and I've mentioned it multiple times when leaving, was the first thing I noticed in myself after I'd been out for a while was it was easier to admit I'd been wrong about something. And when I was very much a heavy Christian, even things that weren't about Christianity, if I made a mistake at work that was innocuous, the process of admitting that was physically painful. Yet when I was out, I've admitted to much bigger things and it's been really easy, and it hasn't actually been that fearful experience that I thought it was. Is that part of what you're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's that rigid thinking. It's sort of like you get taught, especially, I mean, speaking of apologetics, that teaches you to have an answer for absolutely everything. You're not allowed to say, I don't know, and you're definitely not allowed to say, I was wrong and I've changed my mind. And so, yeah, this pressure to have certainty and to be unwavering in what you believe is so high in a lot of religious groups. And so that does make it feels like almost a shameful experience to realize, to admit that you were wrong about something, or even just admit that you've learned something new and you're adjusting your view because of new information.
It sounds like what you're talking about is the transition from the social place, whatever it was you want to call it, the church, whatever, that trapped us into this rigid way of thinking. And the transition from that out requires changing how we think.
Yeah. And that is such a scary and uncomfortable thing for a lot of people, that I know a lot of folks who have chosen to stop deconstructing and, stop investigating the incongruence that they're feeling because it's just too uncomfortable to grapple with. And honestly, that breaks my heart so much, that their fear of changing their thinking is what keeps them trapped in a system where they're being abused.
The phrase "better the devil you know" comes to mind.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's ironic.
Yes. I'm just a Kylie Minogue fan. I'm sorry, big reveal, guys. Deal with it. I'm sorry, I'm not the manly man you thought I was. But jesting aside, though, I definitely remember going through a thought process along that line. So, this is going to end badly, Matthew. What are you doing? Stop thinking these things through, because if you stop and go back, you're comfortable. For whatever reason, maybe because I'm just a stubborn bastard, but for whatever reason, I carried on and it got there. I'd like to rewind just a little bit on something. You said something about embracing nuance, and it feels like the way we're hinting at a way to help ease this change in thinking is to actively seek nuance, seek areas where nuance rules. Look for areas where there isn't a black or white answer. It's not Mac or PC. There is actually, look for an area where there's a rainbow, where there are different options, and where the right answer isn't necessarily solid. And I think I unintentionally hit that before my leaving, because what triggered my deconstruction, what got me into that, was I was working at home and I was listening to tons of podcasts while I was working at home. And eventually I found that I was listening to half of the day, I was listening to science podcasts, and listening to that is just a rainstorm of nuance. That is, you listen to people talking about things scientifically, and rigid absolutes are simply rare. It's all about, this is what we think now, and more research is needed, and this is how this way goes, and this suggests this, but more research is needed. And pretty much every single news item on science ended up, more research is needed. And I think that got that kind of mentality into my mind. And I think I got exposed to nuance without realizing that it was good for me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I had a similar experience, but for me, I when I started my career in counseling, I was doing crisis work in inner city Dallas, and I was exposed to people with all different lifestyles and backgrounds and worldviews. And once I was up close and personal with all that diversity, it forced me to stop thinking in rigid categories because it just didn't match up with all the judgment and automatic assumptions that I had been raised to believe. I think if you look at it from a control lens, religious groups have more power when they can say, hey, it's either right or wrong, like there is no in between. And if you try to say there's in between, then that means you're already in the wrong camp.
Mm,
But in reality, life isn't full of false dichotomies like that.
no,
It's not either A or B, it's A through Z.
yeah.
Um,
And the sad truth is, life is richer when there's nuance. Life is so
yes.
much more enjoyable when there's a range to pick from. Life is just so much more beautiful when it's not black and white. Let's be honest about it.
Yeah. And so
So,
much less anxiety provoking too
yes,
when
that's
there's
what I
other
meant to say.
options.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I was going for. So, what practical things can my listeners do if they feel that they want more nuance in their life? That sounds like a good catchphrase to go for. If somebody is listening to this and they say, I'd like more nuance, I'd like to expose myself to more nuance, I'd like to expose myself to a different way of thinking, what lightweight practical things can they do which are safe?
Hmm. I think I like that you said safe because I think before you can really do any other sort of higher level healing, you have to establish safety.
Mhm,
And a lot of the time, that means starting with listening to your body and your nervous system responses.
mhm,
So, like, if you notice that you're having panic attacks when you are with your religious community, pay attention to that. That is your body trying to tell you something about how safe you feel.
mhm,
Um, Paying attention to your emotions, and instead of dismissing them as being the wrong ones, listen to them, notice them. Because again, that's your body trying to give you clues about what you're actually experiencing. But once you feel like you have established some safety, I think that's a great opportunity to actually explore your identity and all of your identity's nuances, right? Like you may have not been allowed in your religious group to have your own likes and dislikes that were different than the group, or you may not have been allowed to have a personality type that wasn't sort of the ideal for a group member or for a man or woman in that group. Like for example, I'm an introvert. And I never felt like growing up that I was allowed to be an introvert and to, not want to do the meet and greet every Sunday and not, want to do service things where I had to go and meet strangers all the time. But it was such a relief when I gave myself permission to just accept that part of who I am and realize it's okay that I don't feel comfortable meeting new people all the time. And I don't need to apologize for that or confess it. And so I really encourage folks that are coming out of high control religion to look at their own identity with less judgment and actually ask the question, do I like this? Do I want this? Is it okay if I say no or if I say that I'm not comfortable with something? And I think you'll find that you have a lot more freedom and a lot more room for happiness and enjoyment when you start accepting those parts of yourself.
yeah. Forgive me for the tangent here, but you talking about being introvert reminded me of a couple of conversations I've had a long time ago. I've been in churches where a sharing of the peace after communion as part of the church service was a regular thing.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed that. It was fun. It meant you could have a sort of a bit of a high five in the middle of the church service. Wow. But I've also spoken to people who froze with fear when that command was given, and really hated that service, and possibly even left the service or sat in the corner just so they couldn't do that. So little things can probably trigger weird scenarios.
Yeah. And, the more high control a group is, the more sort of one size fits all policies it has and expectations it has on its members. And so a lot of folks in those communities are shoved into uncomfortable situations, and they're told that if they are a true believer, they should like that. They should be okay with it. And if they don't like it, that must mean there's a spiritual problem with them. And so letting yourself out of that sort of judgmental mindset means that you're allowed to notice when you don't like something, or when something doesn't feel like a good fit for you.
Yes. And in that example that I was given, these people felt that it was difficult for them to express that they weren't comfortable there, and they did it in the privacy of smaller house groups, and it made them uncomfortable. It was and potentially unsafe to use the word that we used earlier. Let's take a brief ad break. I'm talking to Anna Clark Miller. This is Matthew at Still Unbelievable. We're talking about religious trauma, a very important topic, a very important subject. Anna has her own podcast. It's in my podcast feed. Please put it in yours as well. Marta, she wrote. Genuinely, I recommend it. So, Anna, you've also written at least one book, and possibly a couple more. Do you want to tell my listeners about the books that you've written and why they should read them?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've published one book so far. I'm working on another, but it's called The Religious Trauma Survival Guide. And it's for anyone who's, experienced high control religion and is looking for education and recovery tools to heal from that experience. And so it's very practical. I give a lot of real life examples. And it's available on Amazon, or you can buy it on my website, empathyparadigm.com.
Thank you, Anna. And links to those will be in the show notes. You don't need to grab a pen out and start scribbling straight away. I promise you there will be a link in the show notes. I always put links in my show notes. So just go down there, copy and paste, simple. Anna, one thing that I've really been keen to ask about the subject of religious trauma, it may sound like a tweed question, but I think it's probably quite important. I hear an awful lot when people talk about religious trauma is they add a third word and they talk about religious trauma syndrome. What is the point of that extra word? Does it actually say anything? And how does it change the definition of religious trauma?
Religious trauma syndrome is a term that was created by Marlene Winnell back in the early 2000s. I think was an effort to legitimize religious trauma as a real experience.
Okay.
And so I do appreciate it a lot from that standpoint. There is, however, I think a group of folks who feel like calling it a syndrome sort of stigmatizes it. It makes it sound like it's a problem, like the individual has a disorder or something. But really, religious trauma is a completely understandable response to a traumatic experience that somebody didn't ask for. And I feel like by calling it a syndrome almost sort of makes it feel harder to accept and understand for a survivor, but it is a helpful framework. Like if you look up what qualifies religious trauma syndrome, you'll find some really helpful examples of different symptoms that you might experience that can really help normalize and raise some awareness for survivors.
Okay, thank you. I think I get what you're saying, because I think the message that I would like to give to anybody who's experiencing religious trauma is that they are a victim. They haven't got an illness that needs to be fixed. They they are suffering because they've been harmed by one or more other people. And yes, they may need help getting that fixed, but the fix isn't their problem. The fix is the cause of something that's not their problem. And what we're trying to do, sorry, me, like I'm the expert, what people are trying to do when they go to treatment for religious trauma is try to help them through that so they can become themselves again. But they are the victim.
Yeah. And religious trauma doesn't have to be your identity. It doesn't have to be a permanent part of you. There absolutely is healing that can happen. And so if you're not ready to embrace a label like religious trauma syndrome, that's okay. You still can access healing.
Yes. Yes. Right. Thank you. So one of the things that you've mentioned several times already is the phrase high control. Now, normally when those two words are put together like that, people immediately think cult. But we haven't talked about cult at all up until this point. We've talked about regular religion. What is it about high control that causes trauma? Well, we've already talked about what it is about high control that causes trauma. What is it that differentiates the trauma causing high control from a healthy environment?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that there's not a clear line between religious groups and cults. It's more like a gradient. It's a slow progression towards high control. So a cult would probably be over on the far end of high control. And then a lot of religious groups are somewhere along that spectrum. Some being not controlling at all. They don't try and dictate, people's identities and all of their behaviors and their, gender expression and all that kind of stuff. Whereas some do. And I think the more high control a religious group is, the more likely it is to fit maybe that label of a cult. But I'm sorry. I think I missed your question as I was answering that part.
It was about differentiating a problematic high control religion from one that is less problematic.
Yes.
But I guess looking for the things that we've talked about earlier probably helps in that.
Yeah, but there are some hallmarks of high control groups that you can look for that sort of will let you know if the chances are going to be high that you're going to experience some of those abusive dynamics. So, for example, if a group uses a lot of fear-inducing threats to motivate you to be part of their group, that is a big hint that there is a lot of control there. So, if they're talking about how evil the people in the world are and like you can't trust them and you need to be under our umbrella of protection in order to be safe from worldly influences, that's a threat. And that's a threat that is explicitly meant to coerce you into being part of that group. Another common tactic used by high control groups is perceived spiritual authority. So a lot of cults and high control groups will say, we have the one and only truth. Everyone else is wrong. Also, our leaders were appointed by God, and so they are inherently correct and they have more authority than you do, so you can't question them. Or a lot of times scripture or sacred texts are said to be, inerrant, or they're completely perfect and you can't question it. All of those forms of spiritual authority intimidate group members into submission and, just sort of automatic respect. And that is a big risk factor for spiritual abuse because it's so easy to exploit people when you have inherent authority over them.
You mentioned Bible verses. One of the things that people like me experience quite a lot because I'm out there on social media. Sometimes I pick fights just for the sake of picking a fight, because isn't that what Twitter is for after all? But the number of times a fool has said in his heart there is no God has been weaponized against me. Is that the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of sacred texts?
Absolutely. Anytime you're quoting scripture in order to intimidate somebody into agreeing with you, that's a control tactic, and I think you can usually tell when someone's quoting scripture at you what their intent is. If they're using it to convey love and acceptance, you're usually not going to have a big defensive reaction. But if they're using it to accuse you, or to belittle you or shame you, that is a control tactic.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Changing subject, changing tack a little. I've got this little insect flying around This is what happens when we get into the spring of the UK. Insects just pop up everywhere, and I've got a light on in my office, and anyway, it's a magnet
moth
for
to
insects.
The flame.
Yes, absolutely. Back to religious trauma then. What is the difference, if you're able to answer, to how this kind of high control experience manifests in children versus adults? Because you get young children like myself who were grown up in a religious environment, so all they heard from a young age was this kind of teaching. And then you also get adult converts, people who are not exposed to significant levels of Christianity until, for whatever reason, usually there's a romantic partner involved, and they start going to church, and then they end up in a high control group. Then is there a difference between the way the high control affects an individual when they're young versus when they're old?
Absolutely. Children have some important stages of cognitive development that really impact how they understand the religious messages that are being told to them. So, for example, if a child hears a really fear-inducing doctrine, maybe about like demons or Satan or something, a child's brain isn't able to acknowledge the metaphor or the nuances there. They will hear fear-inducing messages like that in a very visceral way. And often that terror is much more intense for a child than it would be for an adult. Similarly, that rigid thinking I was talking about earlier, for a kid who doesn't have a whole lot of life experiences that are nuanced to pull from, they hear rigid rules and very sort of black and white, right and wrong thinking, and they adopt that deeply. And so it makes it really hard for a kid raised in that sort of environment to develop critical thinking skills, to develop normal curiosity about the world, because they, from day one, have been told this is the way that things are. Don't ask questions. Don't stray from what the truth is that we've told you. And so it makes it doubly hard for a child to, as they grow up, develop sort of their own thoughts, their own identity, their own way of looking at the world, because they have from day one been trained to only allow their brain to think in certain ways. And then when you look at the shame aspect of a lot of religious doctrines, kids who don't have any sort of previous sense of self to pull from, they can really internalize shame-based messages as part of who they are. A lot of kids raised in high control religion have beliefs about themselves that they are just a bad kid, that they are inherently evil and they deserve punishment. And so you see a lot of self-neglect. Even once they've grown into adulthood, you might see that they have trouble taking care of themselves or seeing themselves as valuable. They might engage in a lot of sort of codependent, self-sacrificial type behaviors in relationships because they learned from early on that they weren't really worth very much. And so there's a lot of implications for a child raised in high control religion, and it makes recovery more complex, but also it's incredible to see somebody heal from that kind of experience when they realize, oh, I don't have to hate myself for my whole life,
You've you've triggered something, that a memory of mine from a podcast that I listened to that touched on this subject. I can't remember how long ago it was, and I had it tickling around the back of my head, and I tried to find it again when I was preparing for this conversation, and I failed to find it. So I never sent you the question, and I never sent you the link. So let me jump in on that right now. I was listening to a podcast, and it talked about this kind of subject, and it talked about what you hinted at just now. And so I'll try to paraphrase it from what I can remember. And it said something along the lines of, if an adult gets involved in a high control religion, their character and their personality changes to conform with the control that's being implemented. If they then leave, they revert to how they were before they joined the high control religion. But when you have a child who's indoctrinated from a young age in that high control religion, like I was, I'm a victim of that, and then they leave as an adult, they have no base personality to fall back on. Therefore, that whole extraction is really problematic, because they don't know who they actually are. Can you clarify that? Have I understood that right? Can you clarify that? And what can people like me do in that situation?
Yeah, you're so right that you don't have a previous knowledge of yourself outside of the group to sort of rebuild. And I was born and raised in high control religion as well. My parents were Southern Baptist missionaries. And so, yeah, my entire identity was founded in my religious beliefs. And, a lot of the natural parts of myself, I was told that those were bad. Those were signs of my, human sinfulness. And so, yeah, those of us who have experienced that kind of thing often feel like we are sort of having a second childhood when we leave high control groups. It's like a time where you're almost going back to that developmental stage of building your identity for the first time, but as an adult. And so I think for some people, there's some sort of embarrassment about needing to do that. But if that is you, listeners, if that's you and you feel that sort of shame that you don't know who you are, you don't know what you like, you don't know who you want to be outside of your high control group, please give yourself grace and forgiveness. That's not your fault that you don't have that foundation yet. And the good news is that you don't have to go through that self-exploration as an adolescent with all the insecurities and instabilities that come with that. You can do that as an adult, and you can explore all that life has to offer without the guardrails telling you what you have to like and what you have to want and what your values have to be. And so I think a lot of folks will sort of experiment with different things in their life, trying on different hats, different identities, and just see what feels natural, what feels comfortable for you. And you might be pleasantly surprised to discover things that weren't even on your radar before.
Go out and do something. It sounds, Anna, like you've just given all of my listeners an excuse to go out and buy a motorbike.
Maybe borrow someone else's and try it instead of buying. But yes, experiment, have fun.
Yeah. I joined a local acting group 10 years ago when I was very, very low.
Yeah.
And that helped. You can't take your problems onto stage when you're entertaining people who have paid for you to entertain them. And they're a great group of people. Yeah, and they're not my church people. And it's been good for me. And it's hard work. It's very, very hard work, especially show week. It's hard to hold. I've got a show in 4 weeks time, 5 weeks time. I've taken the week off work. I'm too old to do 7 nights on the trot at 11 p.m. coming home and a day job on top of that.
Oh goodness.
I'm in my 20s. Yeah, I could do that. 50-year-old Matthew can't handle that anymore.
Yeah. Well, and you remind me of something that I have felt and I've heard other people express is sort of a grief
Yeah.
at realizing that you are finding all these things out about yourself much later than you should have.
Yeah.
It can feel sort of like your childhood was robbed from you in a lot of ways. And there is a lot of grieving and sadness that I think is important to acknowledge there
Mhm.
and to recognize that it's not your fault that you didn't get to explore all of that stuff when you should have been able to. But that doesn't mean that you have to continue to rob yourself of those experiences. You are now free and you can do that now. It's not too late.
Yes, and from my own personal experience, I was a missionary kid as well, and I was taught creationism by my teachers at
Hmm.
school in Zambia. I've talked about it multiple times. And when I learned more about science, I learned to have an appreciation for evolution and natural selection. For a very, very long time, I harbored embarrassment learning this as after my 40s. I felt shame a little bit about it, but mostly embarrassment, but also intense anger, sometimes even rage
Mm.
at those teachers for teaching me like that, and then contrition for feeling that way. And these emotions can have the power to completely overwhelm us and dominate our thoughts to the point that we become less good at other daily tasks. They're normal, they're natural, but we do need to find a positive way to work through those emotions. Don't fight them so much that you hurt yourselves. They are normal, but also recognize that they can have harmful effects. And if we really need to, maybe we need to seek help with handling those. But yeah, I absolutely identify with those emotions that you've mentioned.
Yeah, yeah. I think a lot of us who have that anger about our upbringing in high control religion, we were sort of trained to turn that anger inwards
Yeah.
and to be angry at ourselves
Hmm.
instead of angry at the systems that did it to us.
Yeah.
And so a big part of healing is learning that you don't need to take that anger out internally. And it may not be appropriate to take it out on other people
Mm.
either, but you do need a place to express it freely. And so,
Yes.
therapy or a support group or even just a group of friends who have had similar experiences, those can be really safe places to express some of that anger in a safe way that you don't need
Yes.
to feel guilty or ashamed of.
Yes, and I'm a member of, I've already said I'm a member of a couple of Facebook groups where people are deconstructors. And there have been occasional posts by people who say, rant incoming. And
Hmm.
what follows is many hundred words of pure rant. Do it, people. Deconversion Anonymous is a very safe Facebook group for that kind of rant. And I love how the people in that group are very supportive of those who need to do that. If you need to express
Yeah.
yourself that way, go right ahead. We've all been there.
Yeah.
We'll still love you afterwards. Just do it.
Yeah, and it's not a sin.
No,
It's not a sin.
no, absolutely not. It definitely isn't. So moving on to the practicalities of recovery from trauma. Obviously, the first thing they should do is drop you an email and say, "Hello, Anna, you're awesome. Help me, please." But what other things can people do to help themselves? How do they identify a safe person? Because they might not know who they can contact. Their immediate circle of people might be friends. How do they test the waters among their friends to find out who is a safe person to just decompress with? Because I remember from my own personal experience when I realized that my faith was in dire straits, and I literally went through all my friends at church one by
Mm.
one. Who can I talk to? I need to talk to somebody. And I crossed every single name off. Now, with hindsight, and I look back, there were definitely some names I could have trusted, but I chose to be safe and I chose not to trust any of them. How do we navigate those waters in a more trusting way than I did?
Yeah. I think a lot of religious communities normalize being a total open book in relationships, right? You're supposed to confess everything to your community, and you're supposed to hold them accountable too. It's just sort of this total enmeshment in each other's lives. And so it can open you up to be really wounded if you take that same expectation of relationships and you just immediately trust people completely. And so a lot of recovering, especially with the relationship dynamics element, has to do with establishing trust slowly. Open up a little bit and see how that vulnerability is received. Are the people that you're talking to offering the same level of vulnerability? Are they judging you? Are they trying to tell you the right answers to all of your problems? Or are they listening and acknowledging nuance and validating how you feel, even if they haven't had a similar experience? And like by slowly increasing your vulnerability and establishing trust, you can get to a place where you feel like you can show your authentic self without worrying that you're going to be shamed for it or cut off or kicked out of the group for it. And I think it is important to eventually find a place where you can be your imperfect self. Because if you're still worried that you need to perform, that you need to pretend to be spiritually enlightened all the time, then you're not really accessing those deepest parts of you that need to be heard and deserve to be heard. And so I also think like if you're in a group that sort of requires sacrifice from you in order to be accepted, that's another red flag to look for.
Okay. Now, let's imagine for a moment there's somebody listening to this episode and they've heard a couple of things they've said, that you've said, and they think, oh, maybe I've got a bit of religious trauma and I didn't realize it. Maybe these things that I'm experiencing aren't me, but the expression of trauma within myself. What would you suggest that they do next?
The good news is that our society is like our awareness is being raised to this problem just in leaps and bounds right now. And so there are so many books, podcasts just like this one. There are therapists who are trained in working with this specific issue. There are online communities. And so I would encourage you to reach out and find connection, whether it's reading a book just to better understand your own experiences and maybe have some words and labels to put to those experiences. That can be so powerful. Or hearing other people tell their stories. Maybe you're not really sure how to articulate your own experience yet. It can be so helpful to hear someone else talk about their experience, and you can sort of compare notes and again, get the language to label what you've gone through. And so my main advice is don't withdraw, reach out, connect with people, get educated on what's out there so that you can start changing your view of yourself and embracing nuance, like we talked about.
That's definitely going to have to be a tagline somewhere. I'm going to try and work it out. So the other thing is people who are at the start of questioning these kinds of things. I don't know how many Christians listen to Still Unbelievable. If you're a Christian who regularly listens to Still Unbelievable or just dropping in, drop me an email, please, reasonpress@gmail.com. I would love to know how many Christians actually listen to this podcast. It will be really interesting. But let's imagine that somebody who is still a Christian falls over this episode. They listen to it and go, yeah, like the last question, they recognize some stuff. But because they're still a Christian, they would rather go and speak to a Christian about this. How do you convince them that maybe somebody like you is still a safe person to talk to? Because sometimes Christians can think that they don't want to talk to somebody who's not a Christian.
I think, when you've had your autonomy undermined, you need to establish autonomy and your right to decide what does feel safe. So I would never encourage anyone to go to a therapist that they don't feel safe with, that's not going to be a very therapeutic environment. So if you want to go to someone else who shares your faith, I don't think that's an automatic no. But I do think there are some questions that you can ask to sort of evaluate if that person has your best interest in mind, or if maybe they are going to be promoting a religious message that is a higher priority to them than your well-being. And so, I think you can ask even a therapist, how do your personal religious views come into how you do therapy? If their answer is that absolutely all of their, therapy interventions are all about, aligning with the Bible or with their belief system, well, that's kind of a red flag, because that means that they might be so busy promoting a religious message that they're not actually paying attention to how you feel and how you are impacted. And they might be using spiritual bypassing to skip past the hard stuff that you're trying to process. But that being said, I do know Christian therapists that do not use Bible verses in their counseling. They do not encourage people to go and join a church as a way to solve their problems. And so I don't think that a religious therapist is inherently a dangerous person, but you do need to be very careful to look for red flags that suggest that you're just recreating maybe a system where you're being forced to believe and think a certain way, even if it isn't good for you.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And it's a healthy reminder. Christians can be good people too,
It's true. Sometimes it happens.
Yes. Yes. As much as I might like to deny that, it is actually the truth. Sorry, too much of a joke there. But yes, find somebody that we're safe with is basically the important thing.
Yes. But if you do want to find a therapist that is not religious, there are entire websites devoted to that. Seculartherapy.com is one example. I have a directory of religious trauma trained therapists on my website, and everyone on that directory has agreed to the statement that they will not promote any religious agenda as part of their work because they respect your autonomy as the client. And so that you can find a therapist that aligns with you if you are looking for someone who is not religious.
Brilliant. Links in the show notes, as always. I'd like to rewind again back to something you talked about earlier when you were talking about the sliding slope between a strong cult and a mild religion, and so there's a gradient there. There isn't a hard line between religion and cult. There's a gradient going to higher and higher control, and also marry that with the age at which somebody engages with high control religion. So I'm imagining then that those two things put on top of each other mean that different people's expression and reaction to a high control environment is going to be therefore different. And just because somebody else experiences their religious trauma differently to you, if somebody else's religious trauma in a similar environment is apparently less severe than yours, that none of those things devalue your experience.
Absolutely. Trauma is subjective. If two people are in a car accident, the same exact accident, one of them may develop trauma symptoms in the aftermath and the other might not. And does that mean that one of them's wrong and the other's right? No. It just means there are a lot of different factors, even your genetic makeup, your previous experiences, the angle that you were looking at as you approached the car accident, like all of these things make it just different. And so it's not fair to look at a group and say, well, some people in that group weren't traumatized, so you can't have been. That's not how trauma works at all. And I think anyone who tries to invalidate someone else's experience of trauma has an agenda of some sort. That being said, even like purity culture is a great example of a system where some people come out of that less impacted than others.
Mm-hmm.
Women who grow up being told that they need to dress and conduct themselves in a way that prevents men from committing the sin of lust, they are going to have a lot more to work through in the aftermath than a man who was told that it's not really his fault, that it's the woman's fault if he lusts, and if he stumbles. I know I'm oversimplifying because I know that a lot of men are really negatively impacted by purity culture, but that's just one example of a system where not everyone has the same response, and that doesn't make it any less legitimate.
No, quite right. Thank you for saying that. So back onto the topic of grief, because we mentioned grief briefly earlier, and about the whole leaving experience can be very much a grieving experience. That was certainly my experience of that. And part of that sometimes means we also lose friends along the way, or sometimes people go no contact with family members. I've seen that as a regular theme. Sometimes marriages just don't survive the transition as well. That seems to be quite a common thing. How does the grief of losing those relationships and the grief of losing the relationship with the God that we believed in, how do the complexities of those different grief experiences work with trauma, exacerbate or otherwise affect the trauma experience?
A lot of grieving something in a healthy way is allowing yourself to remember, to recall the good, the bad, the ugly, every part of it, and just letting yourself feel whatever feelings come along with remembering that story. When you combine grief, though, with trauma, a lot of times remembering is very fear and anxiety inducing. And so for that reason, a lot of people avoid remembering what they've gone through because it's so uncomfortable and terrifying. And so a lot of folks get frozen in their grieving process because they are so busy avoiding thinking about the painful stuff that they went through. That's why it's so important to find a safe place, and I highly recommend therapy, but it's okay if that doesn't feel safe for you, if it's somewhere else. But even if it's just journaling, find a way to write about or talk about what you went through, even if it triggers anxiety, even if it triggers sadness and anger and guilt, whatever it is. Don't run from those feelings, because while you're running, you are freezing all of that grief in place, and you're just going to keep carrying it around until you let yourself experience it. The good news is, when you do tell that story, there's often an experience of relief. Like you finally got it out. You finally didn't just have it stuck inside you. And a lot of times the power of those strong emotions of fear or anger or overwhelming sadness, those become more manageable over time because you've told your story. And so if you find yourself afraid of going on that journey, know that it's not always going to feel that way. The more work you do, the easier it will become.
Thank you. Now, there's probably going to be somebody listening to this who isn't going through that, but somebody they know and love is. How can they be a better friend, a better companion of that person?
I love that question. I think it's easy for us to want to give advice to friends who are struggling, especially if we're like, well, I'm not experiencing that,
Yeah.
so I must have some sort of wisdom that they don't.
Mm.
But really, especially with religious trauma, these folks have had so many people giving them advice on how to live the right way. They don't need any more of that. The best thing you can do is just listen, ask questions, and listen, and don't be judgmental. Don't try and figure out what the right reaction is supposed to be. Just be empathetic, and creating that safety and that non-judgment is such a healing experience on its own, and it gives that person to do some of that grief processing.
Okay, thank you. And then go buy them a motorbike.
Sure, yeah. If that's part of their journey, then I guess go for it. Just some safety precautions.
Oh yeah, I've got two younger brothers, and they both have motorbikes, and one of them is definitely working hard on me. He keeps sending me pictures of motorbikes, saying, "Matthew, it's your turn. You need to get one." So that's why the motorbike thing keeps coming up. I'm trying to deflect. That's what it is. I think I've pretty much got to the end of my list of notes now. I'm trying to scan for the one question I've missed out on the way down. Yes, one. So how do we separate, and is it important to separate the religious trauma experience from the life trauma experience? To give a personal example, again, I've mentioned this multiple times, so it's not a surprise to anyone. My parents separated, went through a pretty unpleasant divorce early in my teen years. So I dealt with that for the entirety of my teenage years. It wasn't nice, while at the same time handling all of this creationism and indoctrination into fundamental Christianity that I had. So the two of those were just lying on top of each other. When I look back on those years, there's not a lot of happy memories, but there are some in amongst all the dross. How do I separate the religious trauma from the life trauma, and is that important?
I think it is important to acknowledge that not all of someone's trauma can be blamed on religion. Again, we're embracing nuance, and that is one of those nuances. I do also think, though, that one of the cruel realities of fundamentalist, worldview is that even when you have a trauma that isn't related to religion, the religious framework that you have is right there helping you interpret that experience through the lens of black and white rigid thinking and shame and fear. And so a lot of times religion gets mixed in, even for a trauma that isn't directly spiritual in nature. Okay. So it's all intertwined. Fortunately, I think you can recover either way. It's just important to recognize how religious beliefs, either about yourself or the world or other people, how those tint your view of your experiences in life. And that's part of deconstructing, is just recognizing how much that way of thinking has impacted how you look at the world. And so whether you're calling it religious trauma or you're just calling it trauma, I don't think it makes a huge difference, as long as you're being curious about how your religious experiences may have added to the difficulty of that.
Thank you, Anna. I love that answer. I really do. Nuanced and calm, as always, as this entire conversation has been. It's the tone of your podcast. Marta, She Wrote, is a podcast in which you'll hear more of. Anna, is your podcast video as well, or is it audio only?
Just audio, and I have been on a hiatus for about a year. I just, doing therapy with clients and then doing, interviews on the podcast. It just got to be a lot of talk about trauma, but I do hope to pick it back up at some point.
I hope you do. that will explain why I've only seen a couple of episodes land in my feed. I will enthusiastically await the next episode then. But I did enjoy it. And you are available on other podcasts. You've guessed this is not the only podcast you've been a guest on. I'll find some of those. There'll be links in the show notes. Remind my listeners what your book is again, please, Anna.
Absolutely. It's the Religious Trauma Survival Guide.
It sounds attractive. So again, link in the show notes. Do go and dig that out if this is a subject that you want to. Is there anything that I've missed that I should have asked you, Anna, from the topics that we talked about today?
No, not at all. This was incredibly thorough, and I didn't even realize that you and I have that shared experience of our MK upbringing.
Yes, and where were you? Are you happy to say where you were?
Yeah, I grew up in the Philippines,
Right.
and actually I went to high school briefly with Caleb and Cumin, the hosts of Life Unwasted.
Have you been on Life Unwasted?
I have a couple of times.
I must have heard your episode then. I can't believe I didn't make that connection. I'm an idiot. I'll go back and I'll dig your episode out. I am embarrassed.
I will too.
Yes.
Same for you.
Yes, I was on in the last season, so middle of last year. I had they are great. I need to get Caleb and Cumin onto Still Unbelievable. Chaps, if you get round to listening to this episode, drop me a note. Let's catch up and let's find a way for you guys to guest onto here. Yeah, I was in Zambia. I can't remember if I mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
But yes, they've had a few guests over from that side of the world.
Yeah, I think it's so beautiful to have folks with such a specific kind of religious trauma that many of us have experienced, talking together and healing together and breaking the cycle of generational trauma together. I'm just so encouraged by that. It's something that I never would have expected even 10 years ago.
I wouldn't have even predicted that making a niche podcast is such a subset would have actually taken off the way it is. So well done, guys. I was wrong. You guys were right, and you do a great podcast. Thank you, both of you. Drop me a note and say hello. So that basically leaves me, Anna, with the last question that I ask the majority of my guests. Do you have a favorite Bible character, and who are they?
Yeah, so I did some thinking on this, and I think the Apostle Peter is probably my favorite. I know that's probably a common answer, but I like Peter because he stuck his foot in his mouth so many times. He was impulsive, he was emotional, and I strongly suspect he was neurodivergent because he just kept, being socially inappropriate in a few situations. But he clearly was a passionate person. And, as a feeler who often was criticized in religion for being outspoken and for having big reactions to things, I really respected Peter. And I also appreciated that Jesus loved him despite how many foolish things he said and did. And I think that's one part of religion that I try to hold on to, is that, respect and grace for people, even when they've done embarrassing things.
Peter's the swashbuckling one from the Garden of Gethsemane, isn't he?
Yes. Chopping people's ears off and everything.
Ears off. Yes, absolutely. I'm amazed that the whole phrase sticking the ear back on when somebody messes up hasn't become a thing. But there's always time, I guess. Yes, we can start it. I think I've had Peter once before. I don't have a spreadsheet of all the answers. And for me to do one now will mean listening to all my episodes. Listeners, goodness. There's a challenge. Somebody go out there, send me a spreadsheet of all the answers I've had to that question. Go on, please, somebody do it for me so I don't have to. You'll get
I'm sure AI.
Love. Yeah,
AI would be happy to do that for you.
I wonder. It will have to be able to. There's a test. There's a test. Somebody try that, please. Tell me how you did it. That would be very cool. You said something there. I had a question halfway through this conversation and I forgot it, and you've just reminded of it. You said neurodivergent. So let me be really cheeky. I know the show's all over, but who cares? I've not forgotten to hit stop recording. How does neurodivergence influence and inform the trauma response?
There has been research actually on neurodivergent individuals and how susceptible they are to trauma. And they are actually significantly more likely to have trauma responses in the aftermath of a traumatic experience than a neurotypical person. And so that does raise their risk. Additionally, a lot of neurodivergent people take things very literally. And when you're hearing a lot of sort of metaphorical religious teachings, it can be easy for a neurodivergent person, especially a child, to take those things so literally and to just absorb the control and the fear even more so. So I think those of us who fall into that category of neurodivergent kids that were raised in high control religion, we need extra support and empathy and compassion, because the way we were impacted is very intense. But I also love that we're acknowledging that, and I love how validating that is for a lot of folks that are in that category.
Thank you so much. I will try and find a source for that. You mentioned the study. I will try and find a study. If I find one, it will be in the show notes. If it's not, it means I failed and you've got a challenge. Show notes, dear listeners. Thank you so much. And I've loved this conversation. We should do this again. We should come up with a way of refreshing it, not just have the same conversation again, but
I would love it.
Refresh it or bring someone else in who can help inform. But yeah, sometime next year or whenever. Well, we're only March. Anyway, this episode, let me just give a quick personal update. I know this is poor context for what's just gone on, but personal update for me, listeners. We're recording this at the beginning of April. It's probably July by the time you're listening to this. The reason for that is strategic for me. My house is on the market. I'm trying to sell my house to move here in the UK. And I need a buffer of as many episodes as I possibly can to build up, because at some point over the period when I move house, I will not be able to record for a couple of months, and I need a buffer to cover that, to bridge that for me. So that is why there's going to be a long delay. That's personal for me. At some point, probably Christmas time, you'll hear what's the result of all of that is. So just be patient with me, please. 2025 is a year everything happens or goes to shit or something like that. But anyway, that's a brief update. Thank you again, Anna. You have been awesome. And until next time, be more nuanced.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. That was fantastic. I really appreciate that. You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.